Well, hello, strangers. Thank you. Look, I know it was only a couple of Sundays, but I feel like it has been about 100 years since I've stepped foot in this building. And all I know is during that first song, I took a deep breath and I'm like, we're back. And it's incredible to be back with you today. We missed y'all so much. We really did, and all of us did, and it's so great to be back. But full disclosure, I'll be honest with you, that was one of those vacations I could have stayed there probably another month. There was so much going on, and there was so much to see, and there was so much to do. If by some chance you don't know where we went, we spent about a week and a half in Washington, D.C., and if you remember, I've talked about this a few times. Kelly and I actually lived right outside of D.C. for almost a year back in 2006. And we did all kinds of things while we were there, but the girls had never seen D.C. So we were really looking forward to getting up there and showing them all those things. And it was something we had kicked around. It was an idea we had kicked around back when Bethany was more like in 8th grade. But then, that little thing called COVID happened. And nobody was really traveling. So anyway, we finally got to do it. And we made it count. We hit up a whole bunch of museums. We took a White House tour. We did a U.S. Capitol tour. We went to the Bureau of Engraving and Printing and watched them print off the $10 bills. And the guy just casually says, "Oh, you see that pallet right there? That's $32 million. And there's just a pallet of $32 million sitting right there. So much cool stuff to do. Walking all around the National Mall, checking out the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial. Standing in the middle of the rotunda at the U.S. Capitol was just, I cannot even describe the experience of being in a room that massive. It was incredible. The architecture all throughout D.C., the downtown area, those buildings are huge. And we had a great time. I could have been there another month, but at the same time, we had to be back here. We had to be back with you guys, and we're so glad to be back. And so thank you for allowing us that opportunity. But we're back now. And I'll tell you, one of the things that, while we were there, that really stood out for us was the first kind of like full day we were there, we went on a tour of Mount Vernon, which was George Washington's home, both right before and then right after he served as president. That was his home where he lived. And it's right outside of D.C. in Virginia. And we went on the tour there, and we did a couple of different tours. We did the main tour that is just the main tour of the house, but we also did this preservation tour where a guide took us around and talked about all the different ways that they're preserving the facility, which was surprisingly fascinating. And we learned a lot of history about Mount Vernon. And one of the things two of the things really that are really cool about Mount Vernon, number one, was how it came to be the tourist destination and the landmark that it is today. Because after Washington died, the house passed through several of his family members, and over time it fell into disrepair. And the house was practically falling down. And it was like a bunch of the houses we see around New Orleans after Katrina, just sitting there vacant, about to fall over. And this lady by the name of Louisa Bird Cunningham in 1853, she's coming up the river, the Potomac River, which flows right next to the property. It's a beautiful, beautiful sight. And she sees the state of this house. And she's like, this is where Washington lived. This is a national treasure. And we have to do something about this. And she had this quote, if the men aren't going to take care of this house, well, then I guess it falls to us ladies. And so she got a bunch of her lady friends together. They formed what's known as the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And together they raised the funds to buy this property and then to start restoring it so that today we can go visit this place and see it the way it would have looked when Washington lived there. And that's cool in its own right. But then, almost 100 years later, in the 1950s, another lady by the name of Frances Payne Bolton, and this is really cool, she was there, and she looked across the Potomac River because the back porch of this property is like right on the river, and it's just the most amazing sight ever. And across the river, there's all this natural forest land, and it's just beautiful. And the thought occurred to her, one day somebody's going to try to develop this land. and all of these trees are going to come down, and it's going to it's going to lose something. It's going to lose something. This site, this needs to look, we need to preserve this as it is. And she actually bought almost 500 acres of land across the river in Maryland. All the land basically that you can see, she bought that and then donated it to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association so that they can't. And so today, in 2024, we go walk out the back porch of that house, and you see what Washington would have seen when he stood on that porch. It's the exact same setting. And she's like, the world's changing, but we need like this area. We need something that's going to stay the same. We need something that's not going to change with everything else. And I just loved, Kelly probably more than me was just fascinated by the foresight, the forethought, and just the intentionality that went into that, because she's right. In the 50s, somebody tried to build like some refineries or some oil things on there, and that would have just ruined it. But just the intentionality and the forethought that went into that. And so I got to thinking as I was reflecting on that, as we've been kind of walking through the book of Ephesians, what I'm hoping you're seeing is that in sort of a very similar way here, we have seen how God has shown such intentionality and such forethought into building up and preserving his church. When we show that sort of intentionality and forethought to preserve things, it's a shadow of the intentionality and the forethought God has displayed, because he has made it possible for his church to survive, and his church to thrive, and his church to survive through the ages, and to be built up by men and women like us who are filled with the Spirit and who are going to serve it, and for it to be built up and for it to be preserved. And that's what we do from generation to generation. Jesus said the gates of hell will never persevere, will never overthrow this church. And God has shown a similar, in a much grander scale, of intentionality and forethought. And I was thinking about that woman, Frances Payne Bolton, and how that was just a tiny little reflection of what God has done for the church. He has made a way for it to survive and for it to be preserved. So if you'll recall, we left off about 1 million years ago. We left off with Paul talking a great deal about the nature and about the value of the church. That has been a big deal that we've been discussing. And along the way, there's been this underlying call for unity. This has been a recurring theme. And last time I preached, we covered chapter 4, verses 1 through 6, and we saw Paul calling for us to walk in a manner worthy of our calling. I hope you remember that. He said, walk in a manner worthy of your calling. And of course, he started with a call towards unity. He started with a call for us to be patient with one another, for us to show grace to one another, for us to brace ourselves now for the inevitable conflicts that are coming, because we can't avoid them. They're coming, and he told us to brace ourselves for them now, because ultimately how we deal with conflicts within the church is going to be a reflection of Christ. And it's going to be a reflection of Christ, and it's going to impact how other people kind of see Christ and the idea they get about him. So today, as we move into the next group of verses, today we're going to be looking at 2 of the ways that God provides for that unity and how God provides for that building up of the church through the giving of 2 things: gifts and guides, which is what I've titled the sermon today, Gifts and Guides. All right, so if you will flip open your Bibles with me, we're going to be reading today verses 7 through 12. Let's dive in. This is what Paul says. But grace was given to each one of us according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore it says, when he ascended on high, he led a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men. In saying he ascended, what does it mean that he had also descended into the lower regions, the earth? He who descended is the one who also ascended far above all the heavens, that he might fill all things. And he gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds and teachers, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ. And that's where we're going to pause. So first, what I want to talk about, again, there's these two things, the gifts and the guides. Let's talk first about gifts to the church. Gifts for the church in verses 7 through 10. So with all of this talk about unity that we've been doing, we've been talking a lot about unity and being one faith, one hope, one love. That's not just Raising Cane's slogan, but this is a very real thing, that we have this one hope in the church. With all of this talk about unity going on, you might be tempted to think that we're talking about something else, that a similar but unrelated term, which is conformity. All right, so before we go any further, we need to make a clear distinction there. Conformity is when you try to create unity by forcing everybody to be the same. Okay, now sadly, there have been periods of church history where American missionaries have gone overseas and they've visited these other countries and they've evangelized, but one of the ways they have attempted to share the gospel and share Christ has been an attempt to make those people conform to American cultural values. And so they've gone to these other countries and be like, oh no, you're singing wrong, or you're doing this wrong, or this practice needs to stop because that's not how we do it. And we need to be careful because Christianity is not Americanism. Christianity is not an American religion. Christianity transcends all of that. And so that was misguided. It was just misguided when people have confused cultural norms with the gospel. Paul's not talking about conformity as we walk through these verses and we start talking about unity. We're not talking about conformity. Remember, our unity is based on our one common hope and our one common calling. That's where the unity comes from. But within that unity, one of the things we're looking at this today, that we're going to see this morning, is that within that unity, there is to be a great deal of diversity. And you can have unity without conformity. And you can have diversity without division. All of those are not, you can separate those things. This is by design. And Paul starts this section by telling us that each one of us has been uniquely gifted. Christ has given each member of his church unique giftings. Let's look again at verses 7 and 8. It says, but grace was given to each one of us according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore it says, when he ascended on high, he led a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men. Notice it says that grace was given to each one of us according to Christ's gift, to each one of us. And what Paul is alluding to there is something that we call spiritual gifts. How everybody in the church has received spiritual gifts. Now, I will say this. In this passage right here, Paul is not going to deep dive into spiritual gifts. There are other passages in the New Testament that deep dives into spiritual gifts and gives us lists of what those gifts are. We don't see that here. We do see a subset of the spiritual gifts in a second when we get down to verses 11 and 12, what we call the teaching gifts, but we don't get a deep dive here into spiritual gifts. So as much as I would love to, we're not going to deep dive too much into the topic of spiritual gifts right this second. But if you do want to go home and do some further reading on this topic, I do have a slide that gives you the other New Testament references to spiritual gifts. And you can go home and you can read these passages and you can get a much fuller view and understanding of what these gifts are, how they function, what they're to be used for. We're not going to do a deep dive today where we go through each one, because Paul's not. However, I will say this. I do want to define what they are, and we are going to talk about them a little bit because we have to. Basically, a spiritual gift is a special ability or a special equipping that Christ gives to each believer after conversion. All right, a special gifting or a special equipping after the conversion that the believer is then expected to put to work, to use to help build up and strengthen the church. So you become a believer, you become a follower of Christ, and then after that moment, Christ will give you one or more special equippings or special gifts, special abilities, however you want to call that, which you are then to use to help build up the church. That's what they're for. That's what spiritual gifts are, and that's what they're for. And this is different than talking about like somebody with a talent. And that's people get confused with that sometimes, because everybody's born with talents, natural talents. You have people with musical talents. You have people with athletic talents. We have talents all over the place. Those are different. Those are different. Spiritual gifts are for the legitimate followers of Christ, and every Christ follower is going to receive one or more of these spiritual gifts. And again, they are for the purpose of serving and building up the church. And what's really cool about this, and this is where the diversity comes in, is we don't all get the same combinations of gifts. There's a whole list of these. And according to Christ's mentality, according to Christ's standard, he will give each one of us one or more gifts as he sees fit. So we don't all get the same combinations of gifts. And that's where the diversity comes in. So what we see in this is that there is great diversity amidst our unity. We are unified in purpose. We are unified in hope. We are unified in why we're here. But at the same time, within that unified body, there is this diversity of gifts. And all these different people with all these special tasks that come directly from Christ. We each have different roles to play. And each of those roles is important. And to illustrate this, Paul will then spend verses 8 through 10 first quoting from and then reapplying Psalm 68 to Jesus. And he reapplies it to Jesus. If you noticed in verse 8, it was kind of set apart there. That's because Paul is quoting from Psalm 68, where he says, "Therefore it says," it meaning the psalm, "when he ascended on high, he led a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men." So Psalm 68 is a really cool psalm, but it's what we call a triumph psalm. It's a psalm of triumph written by David. And what it seems to be referencing is a time in Israel's history when the Ark of the Covenant was returned to Jerusalem in Old Testament times. This Ark, which symbolized the very presence of God with his people, had been lost. It had been lost to them during a battle. Now, look, don't get confused. There's two different arks that we sometimes talk about in the Bible. This is not Noah's Ark. They were not returning a boat. Okay, this is the Ark of the Covenant. This is a chest that contained very important artifacts to these people. Aaron's staff that budded would have been in that chest. Manna from when they were wandering in the wilderness. They collected manna and kept that manna as a reminder of how God had provided for them. That was in the chest. At one point, the Ten Commandments, the actual stone tablets, were in that chest. And that chest itself represented and symbolized God's presence with the people, but it had been lost during battle. And for a long time, they didn't have their own ark. But then in 2 Samuel chapter 6, David, after he became king of Israel, and after he had defeated the Philistines, he returns the ark. He reclaims the ark, and it's being returned to Jerusalem. And there's this big celebration, and there's this victory march. And they're marching back in, and David sort of shares in the spoils of his victory and gives gifts. And the picture here, as he writes this psalm, Psalm 68, the picture is a picture of God reascending to his rightful throne. Reascending to his rightful throne in this victory march. And these victory marches, it would have been typical in those days when a king marched through a city or something like that on one of these victory marches, to have some of the vanquished foes coming behind them in a train as a symbol. Look, we conquered these people. And it would have been kind of like this big celebration. And the conquered people would have followed as a sign of the victory. So Paul seems to be taking all of that, and he's reapplying it to Jesus here, picturing Jesus as the one who is victorious. Jesus is the one who is leading the host of captives. Jesus as the one who has defeated the enemies and is leading the vanquished foes behind him in a train. In this case, the vanquished enemies would be things like sin, death, Satan, and that's what he's alluding to as he's just taking Psalm 68 and he's repurposing it to say Jesus fulfills this too. And he's repurposing it. So now Jesus has ascended the throne, and Jesus is the one handing out the gifts. And those gifts, as we see, are both the spiritual gifts that I've kind of been alluding to and talking about here, but also, as we'll see in a few minutes, the spiritual leaders who oversee the church. Truth bomb number one, because each Christian has been given at least one spiritual gift, each Christian is expected to use it to serve the local church. Because each Christian has been given at least one spiritual gift, each Christian is expected to use it to serve the local church. And this is really a key point here, which we will touch more on when we get to verse 12 in a few minutes. Verse 12 is going to really hammer that point home. But the idea that I really want to drive home for you right now is simply this. All right, if we do like a logical, like deductive argument here, if Christ has given you a spiritual gift, and if the purpose of spiritual gifts are to serve and build up the church, then you are expected to use your gift to serve and build up the church. There's a logical correlation there. If that's what the gifts are for, and he's given it to you, then this is what you're expected to do with it. Think of a football team, all right? We have one of those in New Orleans. They're not doing so great, but think of a football team, all right? You have a head coach who assigns positions to each of his players, and he trains the players. And then after they get their positions, each of those positions, when they go out on the field, is different. They all do different things. Each one of them has a role, all right? The quarterback has a very particular role. There are things he does and things he does not do. The center has a particular role. The tight ends have a particular role. The running backs have a role. The linemen have roles. Everybody has a role to play. And each play they run, every time they break a huddle and line back up and run a new play, each one of those positions, they have assignments. This is what you are to do on this play. And everybody's assignment looks a little bit different, but they're each expected to carry out their assignments. Because if one of those guys says, you know what, no thanks, not today. Just if one of those linemen says, you know what, I'm just going to sit down on this play, hike the ball, and I'm just going to sit down for a minute, the whole team suffers. If he sits down, the whole team suffers. If the quarterback takes a knee for no reason, you're like, what are you doing? And it's over with. But if they're not all doing their role, the whole team suffers. But as they do their jobs, as each one of them does their jobs, they're helping to build up that team. And they're helping the team to fulfill its mission, which is to win, believe it or not. That's the goal of the team, is to win. But they're all going about this in a different way under the headship of the head coach and the role that he has given them for that day. And that is what we mean, again, by diversity amidst unity. They're unified in purpose, but they all have different things to do. And the fact that Jesus has given each believer a spiritual gift means necessarily that each believer should discover what those gifts are and then put them to use, serving and building up the body of Christ. If you would go home this week and look at those passages I gave you, it will list a bunch of those gifts, and it talks more in those passages about what those gifts are for and how we are to put them to use, serving and building up the church. Because here's the thing, the other side of that. You may think this is the pastor's job. You may think this is the pastor's job. The pastor is the one who serves and builds up the church. The pastor is the one who does all the ministry. The pastor is the one whose job that is. And the role of the congregation then, it would be to come and sit and listen to a sermon, or occasionally throw a few dollars in the plate. That is what some people unconsciously default back to. Pay attention to what Paul is telling us in verses 11 and 12 that we're about to move on to. And in light of everything else that we have talked about, let's see, and in light of verses 11 and 12, let's see if that's how Paul would describe it. Let's see if that's how Paul sees the role of the pastor in the congregation. As we turn our attention to guides for the church, let's reread verses 11 and 12. And he gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ. Now, I know I'm kind of stopping in mid-sentence there. The sentence does not end. It goes on. Verses 13 through 16 are going to continue this general theme, but they're going to focus more on the need for spiritual maturity and spiritual stability. We'll handle those next week when we get to next week's sermon. For now, what we're going to be parking on is what, or should I say, who God has provided, given to the church to bring about the spiritual maturity and the spiritual stability that we'll be talking about more next week, and the building up that we're talking about this week. Verse 11 starts by talking about God providing shepherds for equipping. All right, and you'll see that on the outline. Shepherds for equipping. Now, we've already addressed the fact that Jesus provides spiritual gifts for those who belong to the church. That's what we've been talking about. Even though, again, we did not deep dive into each individual gift. But we do, however, see Paul addressing a particular subset of the spiritual gifts in verses 11 and 12. These are what we call the teaching gifts. The teaching gifts. It's kind of a subcategory. These people who receive the teaching gifts, they grow into the roles that were listed in verse 11. These roles being apostles, prophets, evangelists, and then shepherds and teachers. All right, these spiritual roles of guidance. And I will say this, there is a continuing debate today about whether or not the first two of these still exist today. The offices of apostle and the office of prophet. There are ongoing debates about whether these gifts still exist, about whether or not people still receive these particular spiritual gifts, and there's arguments to both sides. Certainly these offices existed when Paul was writing this letter. There were apostles and there were prophets. Certainly that's the case. The Greek word apostolos, from which we get the word apostle, literally means messenger or one who is sent. But it just means messenger. That's all it is. So in a general sense, there is a general sense in which you could, I guess, make the argument that anybody who is sort of sent with the gospel is sort of an apostle. They sort of meet the general definition, the general thrust of what that means. And yet, the biblical evidence, and especially the context of this passage, would suggest that Paul has something a little bit more specific in mind here. He's not just talking in general about just anybody who gets sent. He's talking about a particular role within the church. And in this passage right here, he is almost certainly referring to the specific group of men in the New Testament that we call the apostles. The ones who are hand-chosen and picked by Jesus and equipped to sort of go out and establish the church for him after his ascension. That particular group of men who were meant to kind of provide the foundation for the church in those first years. In a technical sense, therefore, we no longer have apostles in the sense that Paul is using this term here. So I fall on the side of no. The spiritual gift of apostleship is not something that is still being given out. Although when Paul was writing this letter, that was a thing. Okay, and for that matter, we have to talk about prophets. A prophet, they're not just people who predict the future. That's a misconception. When we hear the word prophecy, that we always think about the future. Usually the end times at that, the end of the world. A prophet was anybody who was going to receive a message from God. God would deliver specific messages to specific people at specific times. And those messages we call oracles. And that person would receive that message and record it or share it or write it down, and we refer to them as prophets. There are Old Testament prophets, many of them, and a lot of them have books in the Old Testament named after them. Guys like Isaiah, Jeremiah, these were Old Testament prophets. And in the New Testament, we see people also who seem to be specifically used by God at specific times to relay messages to people while, and this is key here, while the New Testament was still being written. They didn't have the New Testament letters like we have now, but we do see in the pages of the New Testament specific people receiving oracles from God that they share with people. But now, guess what we have? We have the complete revelation of God right here. We have it. It's been compiled, it's been completed, and it's contained right here in the Bible. And we have warnings like the warning in Revelation chapter 22 and a warning in Galatians chapter 1 that says that nobody any longer has the right to add to or to take away anything from that revelation. Paul says in Galatians, if anyone preaches a different gospel, let him be accursed. That option is no longer on the table. We have warnings that nobody should add to or take away from the revelation. And from all this, we can draw the conclusion that God no longer uses prophets like he did in biblical times. You don't have people receiving oracles from God the same way. Remember, the purpose of the oracle was to get a message from God and communicate it to the people. We have the completed revelation of God. God has communicated with us, but he does it a little bit differently now, and he doesn't use all those same offices like he used to. So again, I'm of the opinion that that's an office that no longer exists. We don't have prophets like we did in biblical times. So what does that leave? Well, it leaves the other three things he mentions: the evangelists, the shepherds, and teachers. Or should I say shepherd teachers? An evangelist is somebody who has a special gift for sharing the gospel, a special gift for leading people to Christ and drawing people closer to Christ. Now, several weeks ago, when we were doing our first series that I did here, we looked at the Great Commission. And hopefully you understand that it is the job of every Christ follower to be sharing the gospel and to be trying to lead people to Christ. This is not a job that's reserved for anybody with a special spiritual gift. This is everybody's job. There's no doubt about that. And yet, there are clearly certain people who just seem to have a special gifting in this area. There are certain people who just have this almost supernatural way of just everybody they come into contact with seems to get drawn into their spiritual orbit. And they're constantly pulling people closer to God, people at church. They just have a way of doing this. And, we could go to everyday examples or we could go to extreme examples. On the extreme end, there's guys like Billy Graham. Billy Graham, who went on a total of 417 evangelistic crusades throughout his life from 1947 to 2005. And it's been estimated he preached to nearly 215 million people in person on these crusades and led scores and scores and scores of people to Christ. No doubt he had a special gifting of evangelism. That's an extreme example. But I know people right now, today, who just have this way about them of drawing people into the church and drawing people closer to Christ everywhere they go. The church I came from before I came here, I know a couple of guys who have a very special gifting in that area. And it's everywhere they go, they draw people in. And there's people at that church right now that are only there because of these people's influence. They just draw people in. That's a very special gift. And then there are the shepherd teachers. Notice I said shepherd teachers. I did not break that up into two things. The way that the original Greek is structured here seems to indicate that these are either the same role or at the very least that they're so closely related that they should be treated together. Because one thing in particular is that in the Greek, each one of these terms, each one of these titles has a definite article with it. And when you examine the grammar, they all have the definite article the, except for the word teachers. Teachers seems to be being lumped with shepherds. You may have even noticed this in the English text. It literally says, if you look at it, the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds and teachers. It seems to be lumping them together. And some translations will say pastors and teachers, not shepherds. The ESV that I always preach out of says shepherds, but a bunch of the other translations that you might have in front of you right now are going to say pastors. That's because the same Greek word means both pastor and shepherd. The same Greek word that refers to a shepherd is the same word that they were using in the early church to refer to pastors. There was no distinction there. They just took the exact same word. And that's what pastors essentially are, right? We're shepherds. That's what we do. Pastors are called to shepherd the flock, take care of the flock. We nurture, we protect, we guide, and we teach the church. But you also have people who are gifted to teach, but who aren't necessarily called to be pastors. Those people exist too. So again, there's overlap here, and there's very close associations here. He could have meant these two terms to be identical, or he might have just been putting them together because they're so closely related. But either way, these are both very important roles that deal with teaching. But then notice, as we move into verse 12, the primary responsibility of those who have these teaching gifts. The primary responsibility. He says in verse 12, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ. Truth bomb number 2. The primary work of ministry is to be carried out by the church members, not by the pastor. The primary work of ministry is to be carried out by the church members, not by the pastor. And this might be shocking for a lot of people, because I'm using the term ministry in a very general sense. Any act of service done on behalf of Christ to reach other people and to serve other people in Christ's name. The primary work of ministry is to be carried out by the church members, not by the pastor. And this is a huge flip-flop from what a lot of people commonly believe. This just goes against the assumption that a lot of people have. Well, that's the pastor's job. And part of this misconception is due, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful here, but to the development of the theology of the Roman Catholic Church over these last few thousand years. Because what the Roman Catholic Church has done is they have patterned the roles of their priests, the Roman Catholic priests. They have patterned those roles after the roles of the Old Testament priests, the guys we read about in the Old Testament, whose job it was, and they were set apart, to minister at the temple, to make sacrifices on behalf of the people, and they did function as intermediaries between the people and between God. They had a very specific role, and the Catholic Church has sort of patterned their priests after this idea. And again, I don't mean any disrespect, but this type of thinking has given rise to what we call clericalism. All right, if you think about cleric or clericalism is the false belief that the work of the church is to be carried out by paid ministers, while everyone else just shows up and spectates. And again, that was my experience growing up in the Catholic Church. Was we showed up, we watched the ministers on the stage. They did everything. The priest did everything, and then we went home. That was just my experience. Well, this would be a foreign concept in the New Testament. This would be a very foreign concept to anyone in the New Testament, to Paul or any of these other writers. The New Testament teaches us that every Christ follower is a priest. We have this doctrine that we call the priesthood of all believers. We are all priests. You can read about that in 1 Peter. And also in the New Testament, it teaches us that the work of the church is to be carried out by the congregation. It's to be carried out by the members of the church. The pastor's job is to teach and equip the congregation how to do that. Not to do it for you, but to teach you how to do it. To train and teach and equip the congregation how to do it. I mean, let me reread verses 11 and 12. It says he gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds and teachers, all those teachers, to equip the saints for the work of ministry. The saints being everybody else, for building up the body of Christ. To return to my football analogy from earlier, this would be like the head coach of the football team, who coaches the players and teaches them the plays and runs practice and does all the drills and trains them and trains them and trains them. But then guess who actually goes out on the field to get it done? The players. The coach had a very specific job, but it was to coach the players to get it done. So listen, I'm not slamming anybody in here, and I'm not even saying that we have a problem with that mentality. I'm just taking what Paul is saying and I'm explaining it to you. This is what the New Testament teaches. If you think back, we talked a lot back in July and back in August about the mission of the church, which is to make and grow disciples. That's our mission. And we do that, again, by going to the lost, by sharing the gospel, by bringing them into the church and accepting them and welcoming them in, and then discipling and teaching them so that they can start the process over again. That is the mission of the church, and that's how we carry that out. But within that paradigm, there's all kinds of supporting subtasks and jobs and assignments and things that we can all be doing to support that, to hold that up. And Paul is telling us that if you are a Christ follower, then it's your job to find your part in that whole process. Find your part and work constructively toward helping the church fulfill that mission. That is all of our jobs, and it's my job to teach you how to do that, which is what I endeavor to do in my preaching, in my teaching, in my discipleship. That's what I'm trying to accomplish, is to develop your biblical theology skills, to develop how you think about things, to teach you how to do ministry. And it's going to take time to work through all of that, but that's the goal. That's the goal. And a big part of you doing your job is to discover your spiritual gifts, to discover what those are, and then put those to work, serving and building up the church. So again, our text today did not go through all the spiritual gifts, but I did give you some passages where you can go and read more. And this is just something that we'll have to circle back around on. I've got plenty of material. We can talk about this. We'll have to circle back around because spiritual gifts they're an important topic. One of the last things I did with my youth before I left Westwego was we did a series on spiritual gifts, and we talked a lot about all the different gifts and defining them and coming up with ways that if you have this particular gift, you can use that to help support the church. And that was one of the last series I just did with them before I came over here. But listen, even if you don't fully understand the concept of spiritual gifts right now, even if you don't know what they all are, at the very least, we should all understand that it is our job, all of us, to do whatever we can to support this church body. It is our job to do that, to build this body up. And for maybe, and that's going to look different for different people. So maybe for you, that means being more intentional about different things. Maybe you need to be more intentional about sharing your faith. Maybe you need to be more intentional about inviting people to church. Maybe you need to be more intentional about supporting this church body financially. Digging down a little deeper and just making more of an effort and going a little further and support this body financially. Maybe it means being intentional about investing spiritually in each other. Finding other people in the body that you can invest in spiritually. That you can either be a mentor or be a mentee. We've talked about that. Maybe it means doing more to encourage and support one another. Finding people in this body, in this church, that you can do a job of encouraging and supporting. Checking up on one another. Serving one another. There's all kinds of ways we can do this. Those are just some examples. Maybe it just means identifying, at least for now, identifying ways that you have been personally guilty of coming to church with what I would call a consumer mentality. Now, we talk about consumerism out in the economy. You know, a consumer is somebody who goes someplace to buy something and they're looking to get, and that's what a consumer is. Consumer mentality is just the mentality of, hey, what can I get? All right, and sometimes we slip into this mindset of coming to church with a consumer mentality. You know what I mean by that? It's like when you want to go out to eat at a new restaurant, but first we got to read the reviews, right? We got to compare it. You know, I feel like a good steak tonight. Who's got the best steaks? So then we start comparing, I could do some Outback, I could do this, or maybe I don't feel like steak, maybe I feel like Italian. So then we look at different Italian places. Oh no, that place, they're not good. And then we're trying to get something out of it. We're trying to decide which one is going to satisfy our whims, our wants, our desires. Or are you going to go buy a new car? And so we got to compare the features and that kind of thing. A consumer mentality asks, what will I get out of this church? What will I get out of this church? A biblical church member mentality asks, what can I provide for this church? What can I provide? A consumer wants to know, what's in it for me? A biblical church member mentality says, how can I use my gifts and my equipping to serve these people? It's a complete flip-flop. A consumer mentality cares more about what services the church can provide for you than what services you can provide it. So anytime you find yourself comparing churches based on how many programs they have, or how many kids come to their children's ministry, or how many students show up at their youth ministry, or how much you do or do not like the music, or if the pastor tells enough jokes during the sermon, and I realize even saying that, I haven't really told any jokes today. Sorry about that. They're all different. Every sermon's different. Is the pastor entertaining enough? Do I laugh enough during the sermon? Anytime you have these types of thoughts, these are more consumer thoughts. These are more, what am I getting out of this thoughts? Those are the wrong questions. Those are the wrong questions. The right questions are things like, is this the church to which God is calling me? Is this the church where God is calling me to be? Is this church biblical? Can I trust that I'm going to get solid biblical teaching there? Okay? Is this church teaching the gospel truth? Does this church know its mission? And are they trying to carry out that mission? And how can I help this church carry out that mission? Those are the questions. Those are the questions. And if you notice, the focus is very, very different. Truth bomb number 3. Our focus should never be on how we can best be served in church, but rather on how we can best serve the church. I'm thinking of a very famous John F. Kennedy quote right now. Hey, I got a joke in. Our focus should never be on how we can best be served in church, but rather on how we can best serve the church. I didn't call attention to it before, but my title slide, you may have noticed, it was the inside of a church building, and there were all kind of people in there of all kind of races and genders, and both genders, all kind of different races, ages from young to old, and they were all doing something different. And that was the mentality that went into that image, was just everybody in the church plugging away, doing something. Our focus should never be on how we can best be served in church, but rather on how we can best serve the church. So next week we're going to move into verses 13 through 16. And we're going to continue this theme of each member of the body doing his or her part, and how when we work together and when we have the proper focus, we not only grow the church body, but we grow ourselves. We grow ourselves. We become better. We become spiritually stronger. We become more mentally and spiritually stable. And in the process, the whole church grows together. And this becomes a kind of a springboard for the rest of the book of Ephesians, which, listen, it's going to get very, very specific on how all of these truths about growing and equipping and serving each other and thinking of others and putting others first, all kinds of examples and specifics about all kind of different phases of life where we can start applying these truths. And it's just going to continue to do that. So I can't wait. I'm looking forward to all the rest of the messages that are coming out of this text. If you're not doing so, let me encourage you to do this. Be reading through the book of Ephesians. Just it takes maybe 5-10-ish minutes, I think, if you're not preaching a sermon through every 5 words or 5 lines. If you're just reading through it, it's about a 10 or 15 minute read, maybe. Read through the book every day. Just read through it once and get a feel for it. There's so much good stuff coming up. There's so much to be learned. And it's just going to keep getting more and more specific about all these different phases and spheres of life where we can take these truths that we're talking about and start applying them in different contexts. And if we will let it, it will make us better in every area of our lives. It'll make us better spouses. It'll make us better workers at our jobs. It'll make us just better in general with our friends. It will touch on every single area of our lives where we come into contact with other people. And I'm very, very excited for it. And I really love the book of Ephesians, and I love everything that it's teaching us. So anyway, come back to next week, and we'll finish out this part of chapter 4, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Let's pray.